The tank battle at Arracourt began on September 19, 1944, in the rolling farmland of northeastern France, where American forces under General George Patton's Third Army were advancing eastward toward the German border, and where German armored units were attempting to halt that advance through a series of counterattacks that would test both sides' tactical doctrine and equipment capabilities. The town of Arracourt itself was a small agricultural center that had no particular strategic value beyond its location at a key crossroads, but the open terrain surrounding it provided ideal conditions for armored warfare, allowing tanks to maneuver and engage at ranges where their guns and armor would determine outcomes. For American commanders, holding Arracourt and the surrounding area was necessary to protect the exposed flank of Patton's advance and to maintain momentum toward Germany. For German commanders, recapturing the area offered an opportunity to demonstrate that Wehrmacht armored forces could still mount effective counteroffensives despite the deteriorating strategic situation. The German counterattack that developed into the Battle of Arracourt involved elements of the 5th Panzer Army, including both Panther and Panzer IV tanks that represented Germany's most capable armored vehicles at this stage of the war. The Panthers in particular were formidable opponents, well-armored, mounting powerful 75mm guns that could destroy American Shermans at ranges where the Sherman's 75mm guns struggled to penetrate Panther armor, and designed based on lessons learned from years of Eastern Front combat. German commanders committed substantial armored strength to the Arracourt operation, believing that concentrated tank attacks could overwhelm American defenses and create the kind of breakthrough that might destabilize Patton's entire advance. The initial German attacks achieved some local success, pushing back American screening forces and creating temporary panic about the possibility of a major German armored thrust. What the Germans didn't fully appreciate, and what would prove decisive in the battle's outcome, was how much American armored doctrine and tactical capability had evolved since the earlier disasters of North Africa and the initial Normandy fighting. The American forces defending around Arracourt were primarily from Combat Command A of the 4th Armored Division, one of Patton's most experienced and capable units that had been fighting continuously since Normandy and that had developed sophisticated combined arms tactics, integrating tanks, tank destroyers, artillery, and infantry in ways that maximized their collective effectiveness against German armor. The unit's commander, Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, was an aggressive and tactically skilled officer who understood how to use American advantages in mobility, communications, and artillery support to offset the Sherman's disadvantages in armor and gunpowder compared to German tanks. The terrain around Arracourt favored the American defensive approach in ways that weren't immediately obvious. While the open fields allowed for tank engagements at relatively long ranges, the area also featured numerous small ridges, patches of woodland, and villages that provided positions where American forces could establish defensive positions with good fields of fire while having some cover and concealment. American tank destroyers, particularly the M10 and M18 models that mounted more powerful guns than the standard Sherman, were positioned where they could engage German tanks from advantageous positions, while the Shermans used their superior mobility to maneuver for flank shots or to reposition quickly when German attacks developed. American artillery, coordinated through sophisticated fire control systems that the Germans couldn't match, could deliver concentrated fire on German formations within minutes of being called, disrupting attacks and forcing German tanks to disperse or seek cover. The fighting that developed over 10 days from September 19th to September 29th involved a series of German armored attacks met by American combined arms defense that systematically destroyed German tank strength through tactics that exploited American advantages while minimizing exposure to German firepower. German attacks typically began with Panthers and Panzer IVs advancing in formation toward American positions, seeking to use their superior armor and guns to overwhelm defenders through direct assault. American forces would engage these attacks with artillery fire that forced German tanks to button up and reduced their situational awareness, then use tank destroyers positioned in concealed locations to engage German tanks at ranges where their guns were effective. When German formations broke up or attempted to maneuver in response to this fire, Sherman tanks would engage from flanking positions where they could hit German tanks' thinner side armor, or would position themselves in defilade where only their turrets were exposed, and where they could engage German tanks that had to expose themselves to continue advancing. The actual casualty figures from Arracourt became subject to controversy and debate that continues among military historians, with the 200 German tanks destroyed figure representing American claims that may have been exaggerated but that captured something real about the battle's lopsided outcome. American after-action reports claimed destruction of approximately 200 to 280 German tanks and assault guns during the Arracourt fighting, as compared to American losses of perhaps 25 to 30 Shermans. German records, incomplete and contradictory as they often were late in the war, suggested somewhat lower German losses but still confirmed that the battle had been catastrophic for German armored forces in the sector. The truth likely lay somewhere between American claims and German records, but regardless of exact numbers, Arracourt represented a decisive American victory, where German armored counterattacks had been comprehensively defeated with disproportionate losses that the Wehrmacht could not afford. What made Arracourt significant beyond the immediate tactical outcome was what the battle revealed about how armored warfare had evolved and about which approaches to tank combat were proving more effective in 1944's operational environment. And the German approach emphasized individual tank quality and crew skill, believing that superior vehicles like the Panther could dominate battlefields through firepower and protection that made them nearly invulnerable to Allied tanks in direct combat. This approach had worked well on the Eastern Front, where German tactical superiority could often overcome Soviet numerical advantages, and German commanders expected similar results against American forces. But at Arracourt, German tanks found themselves facing not individual American tanks in direct duels, but rather integrated systems that used artillery, tank destroyers, infantry, air support, and mobile reserves in coordinated ways that negated German advantages in tank quality. The American approach, which emphasized combined arms and systematic exploitation of every available advantage rather than relying on vehicle superiority, proved remarkably effective despite the Sherman's acknowledged limitations. American commanders at Arracourt used their tanks as mobile fire support and exploitation forces rather than as the primary anti-tank weapons, relying on tank destroyers and artillery to do much of the actual tank killing, while Shermans maneuvered to create opportunities and to exploit success. American logistics and maintenance superiority meant that damaged Shermans could often be repaired and returned to action quickly, while German tanks that were damaged or broke down were frequently abandoned because recovery and repair capabilities couldn't keep pace with combat losses. American air superiority, although weather limited its impact during much of the Arracourt fighting, meant that German movements were constantly vulnerable to attack, while American forces could maneuver relatively freely. The propaganda value of Arracourt was enormous for American forces and for Patton personally, providing evidence that American armored units could defeat elite German Panzer forces in open combat rather than simply prevailing through overwhelming numbers. Patton, never modest about his accomplishments, proclaimed Arracourt as one of the war's decisive armored battles and used it to argue for more resources and freedom of action for his Third Army. The battle became a case study in American armored doctrine, featured in training materials and used to validate the combined arms approach that American forces had developed. For soldiers who had fought through earlier battles where German tanks seemed nearly invincible, Arracourt provided psychological vindication that their tactics and equipment, properly employed, could achieve decisive victories. For German forces, Arracourt represented another in a series of setbacks that were eroding Wehrmacht capability and morale during autumn 1944. The loss of 200 or more tanks, regardless of whether the exact figure was precisely accurate, was catastrophic for units that were already struggling with shortages of equipment, fuel, and trained personnel. The failure of the Arracourt counterattacks demonstrated that German armored forces could no longer achieve the kinds of breakthrough victories that had characterized earlier campaigns, that Allied material and tactical superiority had reached points where German skill and equipment quality weren't sufficient to overcome the fundamental imbalance. For German tank crews who survived Arracourt, the battle was a sobering lesson in how Allied forces had learned to fight, developing methods that made German tank advantages increasingly irrelevant. The tactical lessons from Arracourt influenced how both sides approached armored warfare for the war's remainder. American forces became more confident in engaging German armor, recognizing that systematic application of combined arms tactics could neutralize German advantages in individual tank combat. German forces became more cautious about launching armored counterattacks without overwhelming local superiority, recognizing that American defensive tactics had become sophisticated enough to defeat attacks that, earlier in the war, might have succeeded. The battle contributed to a broader shift in how tank warfare was understood, away from emphasis on individual vehicle capabilities and toward recognition that tanks operated as part of larger systems where coordination, support, and operational context mattered more than armor thickness or gun caliber. The human cost of Arracourt, often overshadowed by focus on tank casualties, was substantial on both sides. German tank crews suffered high casualties as their vehicles were destroyed, with many burned to death in tanks hit by ammunition that penetrated armor and ignited fuel and ammunition. American casualties were lighter but still significant, or including tank crews killed when Panthers' powerful guns penetrated Sherman armor, infantry supporting the tanks who were caught in German artillery fire, and various support personnel who kept the American system functioning. The battle's lopsided casualty ratio reflected tactical and operational advantages rather than any lack of courage or skill on the German side. German tank crews fought with the competence and determination that characterized Wehrmacht forces throughout the war, but they were employed in attacks that American defenses were well prepared to defeat. The long-term significance of Arracourt lay less in its immediate impact on the war's course. Patton's advance would soon be halted by logistics problems and determined German resistance rather than by any reversal at Arracourt, and more in what it demonstrated about military effectiveness and doctrine. The battle showed that technological advantages in individual weapon systems mattered less than systematic advantages in doctrine, logistics, coordination, and operational approach. German Panthers were better tanks than American Shermans in direct combat, but that superiority became largely irrelevant when American forces used their tanks as part of integrated systems that avoided direct combat in favor of coordinated engagement that exploited every advantage. The lesson wasn't lost on post-war military theorists who studied Arracourt as an example of how modern warfare required combined arms integration rather than reliance on superior individual weapons.